The mahogany gavel hung suspended in the heavy, suffocating air of courtroom 4B. A suffocating silence had just fallen over the gallery, so absolute that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a jet engine. Richard sat at the plaintiff's table, his smug, practiced smirk melting into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He had walked in today expecting to financially ruin the quiet, unassuming woman he had been married to for 8 years. He thought he was divorcing Nora Miller, a small-town girl with no family and no assets. But as the Honorable Judge Harrison Caldwell stared at the sealed federal documents in front of him, the color drained from the judge's face. When the judge finally spoke her real name, Richard realized he hadn't just made a mistake. He had signed his own execution warrant. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when Richard Sterling decided to destroy his marriage. The rain was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse in downtown Seattle, distorting the city lights into a blur of neon streaks. Inside, the temperature was perfectly regulated. The jazz music was playing softly from invisible speakers, and the smell of roasted garlic and rosemary filled the air. Nora, his wife of 8 years, was pulling a ceramic dish from the oven. She wore a simple beige sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a messy knot, a stray smudge of flour on her cheek. She looked exactly as she always did, domestic, quiet, completely unremarkable. Richard hated her for it. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, loosening his silk Italian tie. At 36, Richard was the vice president of acquisitions at a premier real estate development firm. He wore custom-tailored suits that cost more than Nora's entire wardrobe. He drove a sleek silver Porsche. He was a man on the absolute precipice of greatness, having just closed a multi-million-dollar commercial zoning deal that would guarantee his promotion to partner. He felt like a titan, and titans, he reasoned, did not come home to plain women who spent their days painting watercolors and volunteering at local animal shelters. Titans came home to women like Tiffany. Tiffany Lawson was 25, a junior executive in the marketing department, with long blonde extensions, a penchant for designer handbags, and a ruthless ambition that matched Richard's own. They had been sleeping together for 6 months. Tiffany understood the corporate game. She understood the late nights, the networking dinners, the sheer ego required to dominate the Seattle real estate market. Nora, on the other hand, just asked him how his day was and offered him a plate of chicken. Nora, Richard said, his voice slicing through the warm domesticity of the kitchen. She turned, smiling softly. You're late. The roast is a little overdone, but I kept it warm. How was the office? I'm not eating, Richard replied, his tone devoid of any inflection. He walked over to the marble kitchen island and tossed a thick manila envelope onto the pristine surface. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. Sit down. We need to talk. Nora looked from the envelope to Richard's face. Her smile faded, replaced by a cautious neutrality. She didn't panic. She never panicked, which was another thing that profoundly irritated him. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and took a seat on one of the leather bar stools. What is this, Richard? It's over, Nora, Richard said, bracing his hands on the island and leaning forward, dominating her space. I'm filing for divorce. The papers are in that envelope. My lawyer has already drafted a very generous settlement agreement. If you sign it without making a fuss, I'll ensure your transition out of this apartment is comfortable. I'll even cover the first 6 months of rent wherever you decide to go. Nora didn't reach for the envelope. She just stared at him, her hazel eyes completely unreadable. You're divorcing me, just like that, after 8 years. People outgrow each other, Richard said, reciting the line he and Tiffany had rehearsed the night before in a luxury hotel room. I need a partner who aligns with my trajectory, someone who understands the world I operate in. You are happy with a very small, very quiet life. There's nothing wrong with that, Nora. But it's not enough for me anymore. Your trajectory, Nora repeated quietly. I see. I've outgrown this, he insisted, gesturing vaguely around the multi-million-dollar penthouse, a penthouse they had moved into only 3 years ago, after his career mysteriously skyrocketed. "I've outgrown you. I'm sorry if that sounds harsh, but I prefer to be brutally honest. I don't want to waste any more of your time or mine." "Is there someone else?" she asked. Her voice didn't shake. There were no tears. Richard stiffened, but he raised his chin defensively. "That is entirely irrelevant to the core issue, which is that our marriage is functionally dead. But if you must know, yes, her name is Tiffany. She's more suited to the life I'm building." Nora finally reached out and touched the edge of the manila envelope. She traced the paper with a slender finger. For a brief second, Richard thought he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Amusement. Pity. But it vanished instantly. "I see," Nora said softly. "And your lawyer drafted this, without us even speaking about it?" "David Kensington is the best family law attorney in the state," Richard said proudly. "He's drawn up a standard dissolution of marriage. Because you came into this marriage with 0 assets, and because I have been the sole breadwinner for the entirety of our relationship, the settlement reflects that reality. You'll get a lump sum of $50,000 to help you restart your life. I keep the penthouse, the cars, and my investment portfolios. It's more than fair, considering you haven't worked a day in 8 years." Nora picked up the envelope. "I haven't worked," she echoed, a strange, hollow echo in her tone. "Painting landscapes in the spare room doesn't count as contributing to the household, Nora." Richard sighed, crossing his arms. "Look, just read it over. Have a public defender look at it if it makes you feel better. But don't try to drag this out. You don't have the resources to fight me in court. And if you try, Kensington will absolutely bury you. Sign the papers, take the 50 grand and go back to Ohio."
I just like healing.
Nora stood up slowly. She looked at the roasted chicken on the counter, then back at Richard. "Okay, Richard," she said, her voice eerily calm. "If this is what you want." "It is," he said, turning on his heel. He didn't even look back as he grabbed his overnight bag from the hallway closet. "I'm staying at a hotel tonight. I expect you to have your things packed and out of here by the end of the weekend. The cleaning service comes on Monday." As the heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, Richard felt a massive wave of relief. It was done. The dead weight had been cut. He pulled out his phone and dialed Tiffany's number. "Hey, baby," he said, as he stepped into the elevator. "It's done. I dropped the bomb." She didn't even fight back. On the other end of the line, Tiffany squealed with delight. "I told you, babe. She's weak. She knows she can't touch you. Come over to my place. We have to celebrate." Back in the penthouse, Nora stood alone in the kitchen. She looked at the divorce papers, sliding the thick stack of legal documents out of the envelope. She skimmed Richard's demands. "Respondent shall relinquish all claims to properties. Respondent accepts a one-time payment of $50,000. A slow, chilling smile spread across Nora's face. She walked over to the kitchen island, picked up her cell phone, and dialed a number that wasn't in her contacts list. It was a number she had memorized by heart, a number she hadn't called in 8 years. It rang twice. "Director Pierce," a sharp, professional voice answered. "Jonathan," Nora said, her voice entirely different now, stripped of its soft, domestic warmth, replaced by a cold, commanding authority that would have sent a shiver down Richard's spine. "It's me. It seems my little vacation in Seattle is officially over. Bring the legal team online. We have a corporate restructure to execute." "Of course, madam," Jonathan Pierce replied, his tone shifting into one of profound deference. "Shall I freeze the local assets?" "Not yet," Nora said, staring at Richard's signature on the divorce decree. "Let him think he's won. Let him build his little castle in the sky. It will make the fall so much more entertaining." Over the next 3 months, Richard Sterling lived like a king. With Nora completely out of the penthouse, Richard immediately moved Tiffany in. Tiffany quickly set to work erasing any trace of his former wife. Out went Nora's muted watercolors and antique reading chairs. In came mirrored furniture, massive abstract canvases, and a sprawling white leather sectional sofa. Richard didn't care about the aesthetic changes. He cared about the optics. With a beautiful young woman on his arm, his status at the firm seemed to solidify. Richard's lawyer, David Kensington, was a notoriously aggressive shark who thrived on financially devastating the spouses of his wealthy clients. During a meeting in Kensington's sleek, glass-walled office overlooking the Puget Sound, Richard felt entirely invincible. She hasn't contested a single thing, Kensington noted, looking over a file on his mahogany desk. The lawyer was a man in his 50s with slicked-back silver hair and eyes like a hawk. In fact, her legal representation is odd. Odd how? Richard asked, sipping a sparkling water. Did she hire some strip mall lawyer from Ohio? No, Kensington frowned, adjusting his glasses. Her counsel on record is a firm based out of New York. Pierce, Sterling, and Vanguard. Never heard of them doing family law. They're a heavy-hitting corporate mergers and acquisitions firm. Extremely high-end. I have no idea how your wife, pardon me, your soon-to-be ex-wife, managed to retain them. They usually require $1 million retainer just to walk through the door. Richard scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. Probably some pro bono charity case. You know Nora. She volunteers at the dog shelter. Maybe she sobbed her eyes out to some hotshot lawyer on vacation who felt sorry for her. It doesn't matter. She signed the preliminary discovery waivers. She's given up. She has, Kensington agreed, though a flicker of unease danced in his eyes. But I need to warn you, Richard. We are entering the formal asset disclosure phase. The judge overseeing your case is Harrison Caldwell. He is a stickler for absolute financial transparency. You've been moving some substantial bonuses into offshore accounts in the Caymans over the last 6 months. Caldwell will not look kindly on that if he finds out. He won't find out, Richard said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. Those accounts are structured under shell corporations tied to my real estate acquisitions. Technically, the money belongs to Sterling Horizons, not me personally. It's untouchable in a divorce proceeding. Kensington nodded slowly. As long as the corporate veil holds. But remember, the burden of proof is on us to show that those assets are completely divorced from your personal wealth. I've drafted the final settlement offer. The $50,000 stands. We go to court next week to finalize. Perfect, Richard smiled. He checked his Rolex. I need to go. Tiffany wants to look at engagement rings. I promised her something with a little weight to it. Just don't buy it using the contested accounts, Kensington warned. Relax, David. I've got everything under control. Richard left the office feeling like he owned the city. He met Tiffany at a high-end jeweler downtown, where he happily dropped $80,000 on a flawless 3-carat diamond ring. Why not? His promotion was guaranteed next month. His boss, the CEO of the firm, had been hinting heavily at a massive restructuring that would see Richard taking over the entire West Coast division. Everything was falling perfectly into place. Meanwhile, in a heavily secured, soundproofed boardroom on the top floor of a high-rise in Manhattan, Jonathan Pierce was reviewing a digital dossier. Pierce was not a divorce attorney. He was the chief legal counsel for the Falk Enterprise, one of the largest, privately held wealth conglomerates in the world. Seated at the head of the massive obsidian conference table was a woman Richard Sterling would barely recognize. Gone was the beige sweater and the messy bun. Nora wore a razor-sharp charcoal blazer over a silk blouse. Her hair was professionally styled into a sleek bob, and her posture radiated an intimidating, icy authority. She was no longer Nora Miller, the quiet orphan. She was Eleanor Montgomery Falk. The Montgomery Falk family practically owned half of the commercial real estate on the eastern seaboard, alongside a massive portfolio of tech patents and international shipping lines. Eleanor was the sole heir. 8 years ago, exhausted by the relentless, bloodthirsty nature of high society, and desperate to find someone who loved her for herself and not her multi-billion-dollar trust fund, she had created the alias Nora Miller. She had moved to Seattle, lived simply, and met an ambitious, seemingly charming, mid-level real estate agent named Richard. She had given him everything. She had secretly orchestrated the backdoor deals that got him promoted. When Richard thought he had brilliantly negotiated the purchase of the downtown penthouse, it was actually Eleanor who had instructed her holding company to sell it to him at a massive loss, just so they could have a nice home. Every lucky break Richard had experienced in the last 8 years was meticulously arranged by his wife in the shadows. "He bought a ring today," Jonathan Pierce said, sliding a tablet across the table. $80,000, paid for from the Cayman account. Eleanor glanced at the tablet, her expression completely detached. "The Cayman account that holds the embezzled funds from the Sterling Horizon zoning deal?" "Exactly." Pierce smiled thinly. "He believes he has successfully hidden nearly $4 million from the asset disclosure. He also firmly believes that Sterling Horizons is a wholly independent entity. And when does he discover that Falk Enterprise finalized the hostile takeover of Sterling Horizons' parent company 3 days ago?" Eleanor asked, leaning back and steepling her fingers. "I thought it would be best to let Judge Caldwell deliver that particular piece of news during the final hearing," Pierce replied, his eyes gleaming with professional malice. "Mr. Sterling has submitted his final asset declaration under penalty of perjury. He has hidden the Cayman funds, he has undervalued his stock options, and he is attempting to leave you with $50,000. $50,000, Eleanor mused, a bitter chuckle escaping her lips. "He really does think I'm nothing. He is a profoundly arrogant man, madam." "Arrogance is a disease, Jonathan," Eleanor said, standing up from the table and smoothing down her blazer. "And next week, in courtroom 4B, we are going to provide the cure.
Well,
Let's go to Seattle."
that happened.
The morning of the final hearing,
prize, it's
Seattle was
such an
shrouded in a
expensive
thick,
prize,
dreary fog.
$107
But Richard's
is a
mood was
crazy
radiant.
amount of money.
He walked up the marble steps of the King County Courthouse, looking like a front-page model for Forbes magazine.
Back.
He wore a navy blue Tom Ford suit, a crisp white shirt, and a tie that subtly signaled wealth and power. Clinging tightly to his arm was Tiffany, wearing a skin-tight designer dress that was wildly inappropriate for a family court proceeding. But neither of them cared. She flashed her massive diamond ring at anyone who looked their way. "You ready for this, babe?" Tiffany whispered, leaning her head
Down she
against his
goes.
shoulder as they passed through the metal
I
detectors.
don't trust that I am
"It'll be
Mama
over in
Coco.
20 minutes, Richard assured her, kissing the top of her head. Kensington said the judge is just going to rubber stamp the settlement. She didn't fight back. She's probably too broke to even afford a plane ticket to show up.
80 and 100.
They
Yeah,
met
but you
David
actually
Kensington
got something.
outside courtroom
This is
4B.
just base price.
The lawyer
Those
looked
were, like,
sharp,
collector's
holding a
editions
thick
and
leather
stuff.
briefcase, but his brow was
$300
furrowed in
Yeah,
slight
it was like a full
annoyance.
game.
"Is she here?" Richard asked, glancing down the busy hallway. "I don't know," Kensington muttered.
Okay,
Her
is
legal
that-
team filed a motion this morning to seal the courtroom. It's a highly unusual
but-
request for a standard divorce, especially one where the assets are essentially uncontested. But Judge Caldwell granted it. The gallery has been cleared. Only essential parties are allowed inside. Richard frowned. Why would she seal the courtroom? Is she embarrassed?
Oh, we could try Moon
Most
Knight.
likely, Kensington said smoothly,
What's
brushing
he
off his own unease. She probably doesn't want
Yeah.
anyone to
Gone
see
are
her
the
walk
days
away
of
with
actually
practically nothing.
games that don't
Let's
cost
just
you
go
an arm
in,
and a leg
get
or
the
your
signatures,
firstborn child.
and get out. Richard
It's
pushed
alright,
open the
man.
heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B.
It's cheap, yeah.
The room was grand, lined with dark wood paneling, and dominated by the high bench where the judge would sit.
Future DLC.
It was entirely empty, save for the bailiff, the court reporter,
Hi,
and two
Ron.
figures sitting at the
Got
respondent's
hot
table.
lick. Yes, sir.
Richard paused in the aisle,
Hey, where's
his
that
eyes
big
narrowing.
old mama?
He had expected Nora to look pathetic. He expected her in one of her faded sweaters, hunched over, crying softly into a tissue. Instead, the woman sitting at the defense table looked like a stranger. Eleanor, still known to Richard as Nora, was dressed in a sharply tailored slate grey business suit. Her posture was rigidly perfect. She wasn't looking down. She was staring straight ahead, her face an unreadable mask of total calm. Next to her sat a man Richard didn't recognize. It was Jonathan Pierce.
What the
He didn't
fuck?
look like a cheap public defender.
Hi, Ron.
He wore
How
a
are
bespoke
you?
three-piece suit and had the calm, predatory stillness of a man who destroys corporations for a
accurate.
living. Tiffany gripped Richard's arm tighter.
A little accurate.
"Who is that guy with her?"
Squirrel is
She
hot.
whispered. "I don't know,"
Why is he
Richard
going by
muttered,
himself?
a tiny seed of doubt planting itself in his gut. He shook it off. "Smoke and mirrors," he told
I want to
himself.
do a squirrel go.
"She's just trying to look brave." Richard, Tiffany, and Kensington took their seats at the plaintiff's table. Richard glared across the aisle at his wife, but she didn't even acknowledge his presence. She didn't look at him once. "All rise," the
Voice
bailiff
actor
barked,
Bucky, really?
shattering the tense silence of the room. The Honourable Judge Harrison Caldwell emerged from chambers. Caldwell was a veteran of the family court, a man known for his zero-tolerance
said the
policy
thing?
regarding
No
financial
way.
deceit.
Wait,
He
were
had
all
a
the
stern,
Marble Rebels,
deeply lined
actors
face
there?
and a pair of reading glasses perched on the end of his
The
nose.
games expert?
He took his seat, banged his gavel once, and opened the thick
Melody.
file on his desk. "Be seated," Judge Caldwell commanded. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the paperwork. "We are here for the final dissolution of marriage in the matter of Sterling versus Miller. Case number 884-Delta. Counsel, state your appearances." "David Kensington for the petitioner. Richard Sterling, Your Honor," Kensington said, standing up smoothly.
Go-to point.
Jonathan Pierce stood up slowly, buttoning his jacket. "Jonathan Pierce, of Pierce, Sterling and Vanguard, representing the respondent, Your Honor." Judge Caldwell looked up, his
Nice.
eyebrows raising
Board game
slightly.
skin? Fuck yeah. How'd it
"Mr.
go?
Pierce, you're a long way from Wall Street. I don't typically see your firm handling simple domestic dissolutions." "It is a special favor for a very important client, Your Honor," Pierce replied smoothly, his voice echoing in the empty courtroom. "Very well," Caldwell said,
All right.
looking back at the file. "I have before me a proposed settlement agreement drafted by the petitioner. It outlines a division of assets that heavily favors Mr. Sterling. The petitioner claims
Don't go with
full
the
ownership
hole,
of the
man.
primary
It's right
residence,
there.
all vehicles,
Falling asleep? Go
and
to
several
bed.
investment
Get some
portfolios,
tuck.
offering a lump sum of $50,000 to the respondent." Caldwell looked over his glasses at Nora. "Ma'am, do you understand the terms of this agreement? Are you under any duress
Careful
to accept this?"
behind.
Before Eleanor could speak,
Aw, you're falling
Richard
asleep.
leaned
Why
forward and
not? Why
whispered
they
to
leave?
Kensington, "Tell the judge she signed the waiver. Let's speed this up." Kensington stood. "Your Honor, if I may, my client has been
Hi,
the
Roxy.
sole
How are
financial provider for the entirety of this 8-year marriage. The respondent has not maintained employment during this time. The settlement is more than equitable given her lack of financial contribution."
You gotta go for the
Judge
push.
Caldwell frowned. "I will be the judge of what is equitable, Mr. Kensington. I am looking at Mr. Sterling's sworn asset disclosure right now." The judge flipped a page. "Mr. Sterling,
Okay.
you have sworn under penalty of perjury that this document represents the entirety of your financial holdings." Richard stood up, projecting total confidence. "That is correct, Your Honor. Everything is completely transparent."
Have you had
Jonathan
one of those
Pierce
days?
slowly rose to his feet. He picked up a single piece of paper from his desk. "Your Honor, the defense objects to the settlement agreement." Kensington
Yeah,
scoffed
but you
audibly.
silly Billy.
"On what grounds?"
Aw, poor game,
The
man.
respondent already signed the preliminary
Yippee!
waivers.
Hi,
"On the
darling,
grounds
how
of
are
massive,
you?
willful
Thank you for the
financial
raid, I
fraud,"
appreciate.
Pierce said,
Yo,
his voice
how
dropping
is
an
Cyberpunk?
octave, ringing with absolute
Welcome on in,
authority.
everyone. Hope you're well,
"And on the
children.
grounds that the petitioner,
Was
Mr.
everyone's
Sterling,
favorite part of the
does not
stream?
actually
Other than
own
the
any of the
beautiful
assets he
music.
claims to possess.
Hi, hi, hi.
In fact,
How are
he is
you?
currently trespassing in an
Yo,
apartment owned by
Cyberpunk's a
my
good
client."
game. I've
The
been
courtroom
told.
went
Hi,
dead silent.
sweet.
Richard let out a short,
Hi,
incredulous
Mwah, mwah,
laugh.
mwah, mwah, mwah.
"What is he talking
How you
about?
doing?
Nora doesn't own a damn thing."
Oh shit, we got it.
"Mr. Pierce,"
Claim
Judge Caldwell said,
confirmed.
his voice low and warning, "that is a very severe allegation, You had better have the documentation to back that up.
Why is he doing that, though?
I have filed a supplemental brief, Your Honor. It should be in the sealed red envelope at the back of your file, Pierce said calmly. Judge Caldwell flipped to the back of his massive folder and pulled out a heavy, red-bordered envelope, sealed with a wax stamp. He broke the seal and pulled out a stack of documents bearing federal watermarks. As the judge began to read, the silence in the room grew suffocating. Richard watched the judge's face. He expected Caldwell to roll his eyes and dismiss whatever forged nonsense Nora's lawyer had submitted. But that didn't happen. Instead, Judge Caldwell froze. The color slowly drained from his face. His eyes darted from the paper to Nora and back to the paper. His hands, holding the document, actually began to tremble slightly. Mr. Pierce, Judge Caldwell stammered, his voice losing all its prior authority. Are these federal authentication seals legitimate? They were verified by the SEC and the Federal Reserve this morning, Your Honor, Pierce replied coolly. Judge Caldwell slowly lowered the paper. He looked at Richard Sterling, not with the stern annoyance of a judge, but with the profound pity of a man watching someone walk off a cliff. Mr. Sterling, Judge Caldwell said, his voice suddenly very quiet. When you filed these divorce papers, who exactly did you think you were married to? To Nora Miller, Richard said, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. She's an orphan from Ohio. What is going on here? Judge Caldwell took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at Nora, who was staring at Richard with eyes as cold and unforgiving as a winter ocean. Mr. Sterling, the judge said heavily, you are not married to Nora Miller. Nora Miller does not exist. Richard felt the air leave his lungs. Tiffany let out a small gasp. Judge Caldwell picked up the document again, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls like the tolling of a funeral bell. According to these authenticated federal documents, the woman sitting across from you is Eleanor Montgomery Falk, sole heiress to the Falk enterprise, and as of last week, the majority shareholder and absolute owner of Sterling Horizons, your employer. The gavel hung suspended in the heavy, suffocating air. Richard Sterling's smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The heavy silence in courtroom 4B was finally broken by a harsh, breathy laugh from Richard. He looked from Judge Caldwell to Jonathan Pierce, a desperate, condescending smile plastered across his face. This is insane, Richard scoffed, turning to his lawyer. David, do something. She's obviously hired someone to forge federal watermarks. It's a pathetic delay tactic. My wife is a shelter volunteer, for God's sake. She doesn't own Falk Enterprise. The Falks are East Coast billionaires. David Kensington did not laugh. He was staring at the documents in the judge's hands, his face a sickly shade of grey. As a veteran of high-stakes litigation, Kensington knew what SEC authentication seals looked like. He knew the distinct, raised texture of a certified FinCEN, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, dossier. The papers on the bench were not forged. They were absolute, undeniable reality. Kensington slowly turned his head to look at Richard. Richard, he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fury and dread. Did you lie to me about the Cayman accounts? I didn't lie, Richard hissed, his voice echoing in the vast room. I told you, they are corporate holding accounts. Sterling Horizons money, not mine. Which is exactly the problem, Mr. Sterling, Jonathan Pierce interrupted, his voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel. He didn't even look at Richard. He addressed the judge. Your Honor, as of 9 a.m. on Monday, Falk Enterprise finalized a 60% majority shareholder buyout of Sterling Horizons' parent company, effectively granting my client, Mrs. Montgomery Falk, absolute executive control over the firm. Pierce pulled a secondary file from his briefcase. In conducting an internal audit of her newly acquired subsidiary, my client's forensic accountants discovered a severe discrepancy in the recent downtown commercial zoning acquisition
Get
a
out.
project spearheaded by Mr. Sterling. Over the past 6 months,
least we got him.
Mr. Sterling has utilized a network of shell companies to siphon approximately $4.2 million of corporate funds into a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Tiffany, sitting next to Richard, suddenly dropped his arm as if it had caught fire. "Embezzlement?" she whispered, her eyes wide with horror. "That is a lie!" Richard
Jesus.
shouted, slamming his hand on the mahogany table. "I earned those bonuses. It was a strategic tax deferment." "The IRS Criminal Investigation Division disagrees," Judge Caldwell said, his tone turning to pure ice. He adjusted his glasses, looking at Richard with blatant disgust. "I have a preliminary injunction here from the federal prosecutor's office. They are moving to freeze all of your personal and professional assets, Mr. Sterling, pending a full criminal inquiry. You have submitted a sworn financial disclosure to this court under penalty of perjury, omitting over $4 million in stolen funds. That is a felony in my courtroom."
Please.
Richard's mouth opened,
Fucking shit.
but no sound came out. The walls of the King County Courthouse suddenly felt like they were closing in on him. He looked across the aisle. Eleanor sat completely still. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't smiling. She looked at him with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist, observing a dying insect under a microscope.
Sorry, Cole.
"Furthermore, Your Honor," Pierce continued smoothly, "regarding the proposed settlement agreement, Mr. Sterling has graciously offered my client $50,000 to vacate the downtown penthouse."
Dude.
Pierce allowed a rare, razor-thin smile to touch his lips. "There is a slight administrative issue with that demand. Mr. Sterling does not own the penthouse." Richard snapped his head up. "I have the deed. My name is on the mortgage. Your name is on a lease
Holy
agreement,
shit.
structured as a mortgage."
I just want to exist,
Pierce
man. I don't
corrected
wanna
him
fucking-
effortlessly.
Hi, John.
"You purchased the penthouse
Yeah.
3 years ago
It
from a
hurts my
holding
soul.
company called Apex Real Estate. Apex is a wholly owned subsidiary of
Makes
Falk
it-
Enterprise.
Tasty popcorn.
My client essentially
person
leased
made-
the property to you
That's always
at an
nice
80%
when your
loss
person
because
does
she
it. My
desired a
person
comfortable
is-
living arrangement.
I love my person.
The property belongs to her.
They make me breakfast
You
and
are
coffee in the
currently
morning.
trespassing. "No,"
And I'm like, oh,
Richard gasped, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. "No,
obviously gotta do
this-
back to them, you know?
this is a trick.
Top score. Yeah.
Tiffany, tell them." He turned to his
Whoa,
right,
let's go,
but
what is-
Tiffany was already
what is
standing up.
bringing out the
Her face was
dreams?
flushed, her designer handbag clutched tightly to her chest.
Yay.
She looked at Richard,
That's going
not
pretty
with
good.
love,
Feeling a vibe.
but with profound, self-preserving
Get out
revulsion.
of here, dude.
"Tiffany," Richard pleaded, "you told me you were a partner," she hissed quietly, tears of humiliation brimming in her eyes. "You told me you owned the city. You're a thief, Richard. You're going to prison." "Wait, babe, please." Jonathan Pierce cleared his throat. "Miss
I'm
Lawson,
not allowed to live, man.
before you depart, I must inform you that the $80,000 diamond ring currently on your left hand was purchased yesterday at 2:14 p.m. using a direct wire transfer from the contested Cayman Island account.
God, all right.
Because it was purchased with embezzled corporate
Jesus
funds,
Christ.
it is officially the property of Falk Enterprise.
Dumbass.
Tiffany let out a choked sob. She ripped the ring off her finger,
Are you
her
ready for
hand
this
shaking
fucking
violently,
daredevil to come
and
out of the
slammed the heavy
fucking-
diamond onto the plaintiff's table. It clattered against the wood, coming to rest right next to Richard's unread divorce decree. Without another word, she turned and sprinted down the center
come out
aisle,
and get me,
the
man.
heavy oak
I fucking
doors
smell
slamming
his
shut
toes.
behind her. "Mr. Kensington," Judge Caldwell said, looking at the pale,
Please?
sweating lawyer, "I strongly suggest you advise your client to remain silent before he incriminates himself further.
Cheer,
I am entirely vacating this settlement agreement. I am granting the respondent's motion to freeze all marital assets, and I am forwarding this entire transcript to the federal prosecutor's office."
Okay.
Caldwell slammed his gavel down. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "This hearing is adjourned." Richard collapsed into his leather
damn.
chair, the breath knocked completely out of him. He looked across the room. Eleanor was standing up,
man's gonna come for my
smoothly
asshole.
buttoning her slate-grey blazer. She picked up her leather portfolio. For the first time in 8
My
years,
God.
Richard saw his wife not as a quiet, unassuming girl, but as an apex predator. "Eleanor," Richard choked out, using her real name for the very first time. She paused at the edge of the aisle. She turned her head, fixing him with a stare so devoid of warmth it made his blood run cold.
Fuck me, dude.
"Have your things out of my apartment by the end of the weekend, Richard,"
Ooh,
Eleanor
they
said
got a
softly,
Lord
her voice
Loki.
perfectly echoing the exact command he had given her 3 months ago. "The cleaning service comes on Monday." 48 hours later, the illusion of Richard Sterling's life
He's
had been
fucking- how did
completely
he even
dismantled.
become Lord
He was locked
fucking
out of the
Daredevil?
penthouse. His company credit cards were declined at every hotel downtown,
No one's
forcing him
touching
to
the
rent
point.
a dingy, smoke-stained room at a roadside motel off Interstate 5, using the last of the physical cash he had in his wallet. His personal bank accounts were locked down by federal
Wow,
order.
He's amazing.
David Kensington had formally dropped him as a client, citing a fundamental breakdown of
That's
trust,
insane,
leaving
dude.
Richard
What the
entirely
fuck?
defenseless. On Thursday morning,
What the
his cell
fuck?
phone rang. It was the HR department
my
of
bad.
Sterling Horizons. He was ordered to report to the corporate headquarters immediately for a
more!
mandatory executive
One
review.
more!
A desperate, delusional spark of hope ignited in Richard's chest. "They need me," he thought, pacing
Thank
the
you for
cheap
the follow,
motel
I
carpet.
appreciate-
Folk Enterprise might own the company now,
Oh my God.
but they don't know the Seattle market. They don't have my contacts. If I can just get into the boardroom, I can negotiate. I can offer them a plea
Everything's so
deal.
fine.
I can shift the blame for the
My bad,
Cayman
my bad.
accounts to my junior analysts.
Thank you.
He put on his
I'm like all
best
the stuff
Tom
across the
Ford
cat.
suit, now slightly wrinkled from being
God,
shoved
that's
in a
not
duffel
toxic, right,
bag,
for saying
and
GG.
drove his Porsche to the
I thought the game
towering
was
glass
over.
and
I'm gonna be
steel
so
monolith
for real.
of Sterling Horizons.
I thought it
When he
was
reached the
over.
security turnstiles in the marble lobby, his keycard flashed red. An
We
armed
literally
security
just got the
guard
first
immediately stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Richard's shoulder.
Hope you're having a
"Mr.
good
Sterling,"
day, Evie.
the guard said gruffly, "you're to be escorted to the top floor. Hand over the keys to the company vehicle." "It's my personal car," Richard snapped, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "Purchased with a corporate signing bonus, sir," the guard countered smoothly, holding out a plastic evidence bag. "Keys. Now." Humiliated in front of the morning lobby rush, Richard dropped the Porsche keys into the bag. He was marched into the executive elevator, flanked by 2 guards. His heart hammered against his ribs as the numbers ticked upward. 70. 71. 72. The elevator doors chimed open onto the executive penthouse floor. Richard was led down the glass-walled corridor toward the primary boardroom. He took a deep breath, adjusting his tie, preparing to charm whoever Folk Enterprise had sent to deal with him. He pushed open the heavy glass
Oh my
doors.
God.
Sitting at the head of the massive 20-foot oak conference table
Wake up in
was
the
Eleanor.
UK, take however you wish.
She was flanked by Jonathan
Whoa, I'm from
Pierce
Australia.
and 2 men in dark, conservative suits who radiated the unmistakable aura of federal law enforcement. The CEO of Sterling Horizons, a man Richard had spent years kissing up to, was nowhere to be seen. "Sit down, Richard," Eleanor commanded, gesturing to a solitary chair positioned at the far end of the table. Richard's bravado shattered instantly. He stumbled to the chair and collapsed into it.
Oh my God.
"Nora. Eleanor, please. We can talk about this. We were married for 8 years. You loved
Fucking
me
do
once."
something.
"I loved a
Fucking
projection,
witch.
Richard," Eleanor said, her voice smooth
Please
and
have Scarlet Witch
entirely
envy.
devoid of emotion. "I loved the man I thought you were when I was exhausted by my own reality.
It's so fine.
I wanted a simple life. I wanted a partner.
Please.
But the moment you tasted a
Please
fraction of
don't.
success, you became a monster. And the tragedy is, you didn't even earn the success." "I worked 80-hour weeks," Richard protested, his voice cracking. "I built the West Coast Division." Eleanor let out a short, hollow laugh. She opened a thick dossier on the table. "Did you?
The Daredevil
Let's
hurts.
review your brilliant career, shall we?" She flipped to the first page. 5 years ago, you miraculously secured the waterfront development rights away from the Peterson Group. You got a massive promotion. Do you know why Peterson
still
pulled
fucking
out
up
at the
there.
last second? Richard swallowed hard. "Because my proposal was structurally
He's gonna fucking
superior.
come.
Because I had Jonathan Pierce call the Peterson Group and threaten to leverage a hostile buyout of their
Head
supply
eyes.
chain if they didn't withdraw
Roasting
their bid."
Macca's. Oh,
Eleanor
what you
stated
got from
flatly.
Macca's?
She flipped another
Yeah,
page.
Get it, what is?
3 years ago, You landed the city
The
zoning
fact that
contract.
the tanks
The mayor
aren't looking
pushed it through
behind
for
is
you.
wild.
You thought it was your sheer charisma
You're
at that
fine.
charity
You wanna
gala.
join us for the next
It was
one?
actually because Falk Enterprise quietly donated $3 million to the mayor's re-election PAC the week prior. Richard stared at her, the blood rushing in his ears. Every accomplishment, every pillar of his massive ego was crumbling into dust before his
Fucking
eyes.
get back, dumb!
You are not a titan of
He's dumb.
industry, Richard, Eleanor said, looking him dead in the eye. You are a mediocre middle manager who was propped up by his
must
wife's
sound so-
invisible empire. I gave you the world because I wanted you to be happy. And the moment you felt you were above me, you tried to
I'm
throw
just
me
gonna
away
go-
with a $50,000
Oh.
check. She closed the dossier. I am officially terminating your employment at Sterling Horizons, effective immediately, for gross misconduct, breach of fiduciary duty, and felony embezzlement. Your stock options are voided.
Please!
Your severance package is denied.
Please!
You have nothing. Eleanor gestured to the two men standing near the wall. They stepped forward, pulling golden badges from their jacket
I can't
pockets.
get out of the emojis?
Richard Sterling, one of the agents said,
Oh my
his voice
God.
hard and bureaucratic.
Brady, are you a tank man?
We are with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Division. We have a warrant for your arrest
dude.
regarding the interstate wire fraud and embezzlement of $4.2 million. The agent pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. Richard's vision swam. He looked at Eleanor, tears of absolute
You're
panic
everything.
streaming down his face.
Oh, you know how to
Eleanor,
rotate
please,
your head,
I'll do
right?
anything. I'll sign whatever you want. Just call them off.
I need an alpha
Please.
to come protect. I need a
Eleanor
tank that
stood
knows
up.
how to tone its
She looked down the long expanse of the
GG.
boardroom table at the weeping,
Oh, that
shattered
was
man
rough,
she had
dude.
once called her husband.
That
The divorce
Daredevil
papers
was
are already
great.
signed, Richard, Eleanor said quietly. You outgrew our quiet life.
EPS diff.
Now it's time to align with your new trajectory. She turned and walked out of the boardroom, the sound of the metal handcuffs clicking shut behind her. The Metropolitan Correctional
just
Center
absolutely
was
fucking
a
annihilated.
sensory nightmare.
Wild.
For a
You're
man
like,
who had
"Five?
spent
Oh,
the last
wow."
3 years
Might take a
complaining
cheeky pee
if the
break.
ambient temperature in his penthouse fluctuated by 2 degrees, the damp, freezing air and the relentless
guess.
echoing clang
Nah,
of
he'll
steel
diff.
doors were a special kind of hell.
Okay.
Richard
gonna get up,
Sterling
stretchy,
sat on a
snacky
rigid
water.
metal
Highly
cot,
recommend that you guys get up,
staring
stretchy,
blankly at
snacky
the
water.
cinder block
If
wall.
you have your medication,
He wore a
get your
scratchy,
medication.
oversized
Enjoy the
orange
movie.
jumpsuit. It had been 4 months since the disastrous divorce hearing in courtroom 4B. 4 months since Eleanor had systematically dismantled his entire existence with the surgical precision of a master tactician. His arraignment had been a humiliating public spectacle.
Double-cheeked.
Because the federal government had frozen all assets tied to his name, which were, in reality, tied to the embezzled corporate funds of Falk Enterprise, Richard was declared legally indigent. The irony was suffocating. The man who had sneered at the idea of his wife using a public defender was now sitting next to one. Arthur Pendleton, an overworked, perpetually exhausted public defender with coffee stains on his lapel, had tried his best. But when the prosecution presented a mountain of forensic accounting evidence, complete with wire transfer logs signed by Richard and hidden servers linked directly to his IP address, Arthur had just sighed. Bail had been set at $2 million. Richard couldn't even afford a candy bar from the commissary, let alone a bondsman. He had remained behind bars, entirely abandoned. The trial began on a bitter, snow-dusted Tuesday in January. Federal Judge Thomas Albright presided over the courtroom, projecting an aura of absolute, unforgiving authority. Richard sat at the defense table, his skin pale and sallow, his hair thinning from stress. He looked nothing like the arrogant titan of real estate who had tried to buy his mistress an $80,000 ring. He looked like exactly what he was, a frightened, broken man. The lead prosecutor, Madeline Ross, was a shark in a tailored navy suit. She didn't just present the evidence. She painted a devastating portrait of a profoundly mediocre man who had stolen millions in a desperate bid to maintain an illusion of grandeur. The defendant, Richard Sterling, didn't act alone in a vacuum, but he was the sole architect of the fraud, Prosecutor Ross stated during her opening remarks, pacing before the jury. He utilized his position at Sterling Horizons to funnel $4.2 million of corporate capital into the Apex Horizon Trust, a Cayman-based shell company. He did this not to save his company, but to fund a lavish lifestyle that he fundamentally could not afford, and to hide these assets during a pending divorce proceeding. But the most agonizing moment for Richard wasn't the forensic accountants breaking down the IP logs, or the FBI agents testifying about the seizure of his electronic devices. It was the prosecution's star witness. "The state calls Tiffany Lawson," Ross announced. The courtroom doors opened, and Tiffany walked down the aisle. She wore a modest, high-collared black dress, a stark departure from the skin-tight designer outfits Richard had bought her. She didn't look at him as she took the stand and swore on the Bible. To save herself from being indicted as an accessory after the fact, Tiffany had cut a full immunity deal with the federal prosecutor. She had turned over every text message, every email, and every gift Richard had ever given her. "Ms. Lawson," Prosecutor Ross began gently, "can you describe the defendant's demeanor regarding his finances in the months leading up to his arrest?" He was obsessive," Tiffany said, her voice trembling slightly, playing the role of the naive, manipulated girlfriend flawlessly. "He told me he was moving money around to make sure his wife didn't get a dime. He bragged about it. He said she was weak, that she wouldn't understand corporate tax shelters, and that he was going to walk away with millions while leaving her with nothing." "Objection!" Richard hissed, half standing from his chair. "She knew. She helped me pick the offshore banks. Mr. Sterling, sit down and remain silent, or I will have you gagged," Judge Albright barked, his gavel hitting the sound block with a sharp crack. Arthur Pendleton pulled Richard back down by the sleeve of his orange jumpsuit. "Are you trying to add a contempt charge to the list?" the public defender whispered furiously. "Shut up!" Richard slouched in his chair, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. He watched as Tiffany systematically destroyed his character, detailing his arrogance, his infidelity, and his blatant, spoken intentions to commit financial fraud against his wife and his company. When Tiffany finally stepped down, she walked right past the defense table. For a fraction of a second, her eyes met Richard's. There was no pity. There was only the cold relief of a rat successfully fleeing a sinking ship. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When the foreperson stood to read the verdict, the courtroom was dead silent. Richard felt his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He closed his eyes, desperately praying for a miracle, for a technicality, for Eleanor to suddenly burst through the doors and say it was all a test and that she was taking him home. On the first count of the indictment, interstate wire fraud, how do you find? Judge Albright asked. "We find the defendant, Richard Sterling, guilty, Your Honor." On the second count, corporate embezzlement. "Guilty, Your Honor." On the third count, perjury. "Guilty." The words struck Richard like physical blows. He didn't cry. He was too hollowed out, entirely depleted of anything resembling hope. 2 weeks later, Richard stood before Judge Albright for sentencing. The federal guidelines for his crimes were severe, exacerbated by his lack of cooperation and his initial attempts to blame his subordinates. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Albright said, looking down from the bench with a mixture of stern judgment and mild disgust, "in my 20 years on the federal bench, I have seen masterminds, and I have seen fools. You, sir, are profoundly the latter. You were handed a life of absolute privilege, stability, and support. Instead of harboring gratitude, you allowed your ego to convince you that you were a giant, when in reality, you were merely standing on the shoulders of someone much smarter and much kinder than you." The judge adjusted his glasses, reading from the final sentencing report. "You attempted to financially ruin a woman you believed to be defenseless, and you stole millions from your employer to fund a facade. For these crimes, I sentence you to 96 months, 8 years, in a federal penitentiary. You are also ordered to pay full restitution of the $4.2 million, though I suspect it will take you the rest of your natural life to earn even a fraction of that back. The gavel fell. It was the final,
Did everyone get a
definitive
stretchy,
sound
snacky
of
water?
Richard Sterling's life ending. The marshals flanked him, hooking their hands under his arms, and led him out of the courtroom. As he was marched down the
Hi,
hallway,
peeps.
the
Thank
heavy
you for the
metal
RGB
doors
gift.
closing behind him, the suffocating
Uh,
reality set in.
I need
He
to
was a
roll this
nobody
one.
again. And this time, there was no one in the shadows to build him back up. Hundreds of miles away, in a sprawling, sunlit penthouse overlooking Central Park, Eleanor
Brady,
Montgomery
leave it
Falk
down.
stood in front of a massive canvas.
We need another file.
She wore a pair of
Hi,
faded,
Clips, how are you?
paint-splattered jeans
I think
and a
I
simple
have
white
to.
t-shirt. Her hair was pulled back in a messy
I
knot,
don't think so.
a stray smudge of cerulean blue
None
on her
update, that's
cheek.
okay, we'll play one
The
without
television
you.
in the
We'll play
background
an
was
18
muted,
plus 18.
a rolling news
it's nice
ticker
and
at the
quick.
bottom of the screen, flashing
And then it doesn't
Seattle
feel
Real
as bad
Estate.
when we lose, right?
exec sentenced to 8
you
years
alright?
in federal prison for embezzlement.
Is it just Brady underscore?
Eleanor glanced at the screen
Minor
for a
P?
moment.
Aw.
Her face remained perfectly calm. There was no wicked smile of triumph, no
Is
lingering
it just
bitterness.
normal?
The
Brady
anger
underscore-
had burned out months ago,
Brady
replaced by a
underscore
profound,
IUS.
clarifying peace.
No!
Jonathan Pierce stepped into the room, holding
No.
a sleek tablet.
We got taken.
Madam, he said respectfully, the European acquisition has been finalized, and the Seattle legal team just confirmed the sentencing. It's done. Thank you, Jonathan,
Surprise Scarlet.
Eleanor said softly. She didn't look away from her painting. Liquidate the remaining
Or we
assets
could
of
just be
Sterling
annoying
Horizons
with a bunch
and
of
absorb the
squirrels.
personnel into the main Falk
That could be
umbrella.
quite annoying.
I don't want to hear that company's name again.
Kick butt.
Understood. Pierce nodded, turning to leave. Will you be coming into the office today? No, Eleanor smiled, picking up a palette knife and mixing a vibrant shade of gold into the blue. I think I'll just stay here and paint today. I'm finally starting to like the view. For 8 years, she had hidden her strength to make a weak man feel tall. She had played the quiet, unremarkable wife because she thought it was the price of a normal life. But as the afternoon sun poured over the Manhattan skyline, illuminating her canvas, Eleanor realized she didn't need to choose between her power and her peace. She owned both, and she would never apologize for either again. He filed for divorce. Without a second thought, until the judge heard her real name, is a story that explores the blinding nature of arrogance and the quiet, often underestimated power of genuine strength. Richard Sterling's downfall was not simply a product of corporate revenge. It was the inevitable collapse of a life built entirely on deceit, vanity, and the tragic assumption that kindness equates to weakness. He mistook Eleanor's humility for subservience, a fatal miscalculation that exposed him to the cold, unforgiving reality of his own mediocrity. Ultimately, the narrative serves as a stark reminder that the masks we wear to impress the world eventually slip, and when the dust settles, true authority belongs to those who do not need to shout to be heard.